Hey you guys, welcome back to History 1302. Today's lecture is World War I. So here are our objectives. The first things we're going to do is we're going to discuss the major reasons for the outbreak of war in 1914. And then we're going to talk about, the American experiences during the war, both at home and abroad. And then when we're done with World War I, we are going to explain the effects of the Treaty of Versailles, and then, of course, the consequences of the war itself. Long standing consequences of the war. So there's going to be lots to talk about today. First things first, let's go ahead and discuss the long-term causes of the war. Okay, this is not the immediate cause of the war. These are things that had been happening for a while. So let's discuss them. The first thing here is nationalism, okay? Nationalism is a deep sense of pride and loyalty to one's nation. A specific form of nationalism is super patriotism, which is jingoism. Okay, remember how I told you in the last lecture about Teddy Roosevelt being like this ultimate symbol of jingoism? Okay. Like that's what we're talking about. Okay, so it's like super mega ultra patriotism, and so this nationalism is one of the long-term causes of the war, because it'd been happening already for a while, but it's essentially because the people that are experiencing this great sense of nationalism and jingoism to a greater extent believe that their nation is the best, and the people in their nation are the best, better than anybody else, and are willing and ready to prove it. So when war breaks out, they're all like, yeah, let's go fight, they're like cheering and stuff like that. And where we get into trouble here, really, like where in the Balkans especially, is where you have these other groups, these sub-nations, right? They're a part of a greater nation or an empire, right? Austria-Hungary, I'm talking to you, where there are these other little subgroups, right? These other ethnic identities and nationalities that want independence. They don't identify with the country or the empire that is running them, and they want independence. So Serbia, for example, is a great indicator, a great example of what nationalism and how it leads to the outbreak of war. Okay, so yeah, lots of these countries experience high levels of nationalism, but it's even worse when you have all of these little sub-nations that want independence too. Another long-term cause of World War I is, of course, imperialism. So in the last lecture, we talked about American imperialism and what steps the United States took to sort of build an empire. Well, the fact of the matter is that other countries were doing that too. In fact, they'd been doing it already for some time, and the United States was just kind of getting late into the game. So what happens here is you have all of these industrialized nations that they want colonies, okay? So there's all kinds of competition for resources and wealth, that more land equals power, more resources and all of that stuff. The largest empires are the ones with the largest amount of colonies, have the most wealth, have the most power, have the most prestige, have the biggest militaries, and of course, imperialism and the quest for building an empire is going to intensify these long-standing rivalries, right, that go back, centuries between some of these older, European powers. So imperialism is another reason why these countries are going to go to war in 1914. Here's a great sort of illustration of that, where you have China, right? Like everybody wants a piece of China, everybody wants a piece of that pie. And so you've got, England, you've got Prussia, which is, of course, Germany, and then you got Russia, right? The Tsar and the Tsarina, and Japan, among just some of the, big powers, big nations that want a piece of China. So that's what we're talking about here, imperialism, right? It's going to create a lot of competition between these countries that already have long-standing rivalries. A third long-term cause of the war is, of course, militarism. So as these nations began to industrialize and they developed better technology, better machines and process to, turn steel into finished goods and products, weapons is another part of this too. So remember that, having a big navy, part of industrialism is that these countries are going to start to build up their military as well. So, we're talking about, all steel ships, we're talking about machine guns, we're talking about, tanks and U-boats and stuff like that. In fact, I'll show you a couple pictures in a little bit. But essentially, it boils down to this. The greater the military, the greater the nation. Remember, like Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy, right? The bigger the military, the bigger the stick, the better the chance that you can compel your enemies or your foes into doing what you want. And so again, this goes back to the Industrial Revolution, giving the capacity, right, the capability for these nations to build these powerful weapons. And although, maybe at the time they didn't know it, is essentially, the start of an arms race in Europe. And so, of course, you've got large artillery, right, so big that, they had to be transported in pieces by train. You got machine guns. Remember, this is going to be one of the deadliest weapons out there. It's what they call, the invisible enemy. Super easy to operate, highly effective, takes very little actual skill, to overpower the enemy here. One of the major changes in the type of fighting that they're going to see in World War I is because really, they're expecting this kind of war where it's like all close range and, you don't shoot until you see the whites of, the enemy's eyes. And that's not what they get. Like literally at the start of all of this, they're like rolling in with the cavalry. And, it's like, what? And then they get faced with these machine guns or those guns, artillery shells that are 2 miles away. I mean, you don't even see it coming. You don't even see it coming. And that's why a lot of these soldiers, when they're right back, when they're riding from, the front, riding back to their families or their loved ones, they're just keeping journals. They talk about the invisible enemy. It's like, how do you fight that? How do you... Anyway, so we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Remember, we're also entering a new era of, battleships, all steel, with not missiles, but eventually we'll get to that, right? But with these cannons and stuff like that, not like the old school cannons, but, shells and very high-tech stuff at this time. Okay, so obviously we've got nationalism, militarism, what else did I say? Imperialism. And then, of course, we have secret diplomacy. So these alliances, these system of alliances, why is this a problem? And how does this lead to the outbreak of war? Well, the history behind this, we could take it all the way back to, the French Revolution and towards the end of it, how these European nations, they wanted to establish peace and sort of like prevent another war like that from happening again. And more importantly, really to prevent like another Napoleon, right? Trying to like take over large swaths of Europe. So they entered into this agreement, right? These alliances, which were designed to prevent a war, okay? To maintain the balance of power. These nations are essentially promising to defend one another in the event that such a country would rise up and attack them. Now, let's talk about why that's a problem and how it leads into, World War I. Think of it this way, okay? Pretend that, you've got a problem with somebody that you know personally, or maybe you don't know them at all, right? You got beef with someone. And this person sees you somewhere in the hall or on the street or on a restaurant or something. And basically calls you out and, once, sort of like this, like, hey, you want to take it outside sort of thing. If you went ahead and proceeded to, engage in any kind of physical altercation with somebody, and you go out there, you've already made up your mind, you're gonna take care of this, right? But you go outside and then it's this guy and his buddies. They're all there. And then it's just you. Right? That's how deterrence, in theory, that's how it was supposed to work, right? This alliance, that if you have these alliances, if a country were to declare war on you and then your buddies jump in, then this is going to make them go, whoa, never mind, I don't want any of that. But that's not what happens in World War I, right? Because essentially when war breaks out, right, and we're going to think of it in terms of like, this is a fight that's going to take place in a parking lot. You got these two people that are going to go head to head, and then instead of it just being them two, this person's buddies show up to back him up, right, to give him throw esquina. And then on the other side, you have the other person and his buddies. And then what do you got, right? It's not a deterrent. It doesn't end up as you don't stop the fight from taking place. It ends up into like a brawl, right? And that is essentially what is happening here. So secret diplomacies, these set of alliances, right, that were supposed to prevent war, it's supposed to deter it, is actually one of the reasons why it becomes this like major event, where instead of it being something between Austria and the Serbs, it becomes into those alliances are triggered and it becomes a worldwide conflict, okay, with dozens of countries involved here. Okay, so one of the things I want to be clear about is that none of these reasons, none of these causes create or cause the war on its own, right? What do we say we have? Let me explain something to you, okay? You've got nationalism, which contributes to not only these, countries and people wanting to go to war, and essentially as the war drags on, it's going to be one of the factors that is going to really push these generals, push these nations into not seeking a truce, because they just want to prove so bad that that they're going to win, that they're better, that they're going to dominate, to the point where they end up in a stalemate. Okay, so nationalism, long-term reason, but on its own, it doesn't cause a war. Imperialism, it pushes these countries closer and closer to compete with one another. Rivalries are intensified, and again, it doesn't cause the war on its own, but it pushes these nations closer and closer, because there's just so much at stake, and they're not willing to give it up, right? Their colonial claims and stuff like that, or imperial ambitions, like in the case of Italy. Then we have militarism. Does militarism cause a war? Does an arms race cause a war? No. But when you factor that in, it is a part of the reason why there are so many dead. Like 9 million people die because of the war. The tremendous loss of life, the number of people that are going to be affected by it, physically, psychologically, you name it. The nature of the war, it's a war of attrition, like I said, the invisible enemy and stuff like that. And it's also part of the reason why it lasts such a long time as well. These nations are, very weaponized, very well, backed up in terms of, weapons and ammunition and all that stuff, okay? So again, not the sole cause of the war on its own. It doesn't take it very far, but again, it's like another ingredient that we're throwing in the mix. And then of course the last one here is the secret diplomacies. Now, is this going to cause a war? No, but again, it is a huge factor because instead of it just being two nations at war with one another, once those alliances are triggered and countries start jumping in, then it becomes a worldwide, war. And again, lots of people are affected by this. The way that I want you to think of these long-term causes is that neither one of them are the sole cause or responsible for creating the war. But when you put all of these things together, it's not secret, but it's almost like a perfect storm. Okay, so when you bring the militarism, the imperialism, the nationalism, and those alliances into it, is when you have a war on this scale affecting this many people, making it almost impossible to end. And it's just completely devastating to all of those involved, okay? So that's my shtick for that. Let's talk about the major European nations that are involved here. And again, there's dozens. There's like close to 60 nations, but we're only going to focus on a few. So on one side, you have Great Britain. Little background to them. Huge overseas empire, right? Very large, very industrialized, huge, powerful navy. We know that already because of Thayer Mahan's book, right, on the importance of sea power. And they don't have a very large army because, again, they are an island nation. So they don't need a big, powerful army. They need a big, powerful navy, which they have. On the other hand, we have Germany. Now, Germany has a small overseas empire. They are very industrialized. They're like second power right here. Large army and huge ambitions as well. And we'll get to the Archduke, not the Archduke, but the Kaiser in a second. And then we have France, medium overseas empire, also very industrialized. Remember that these countries are competing with each other, right? Getting closer and closer to 1914. A large army, rich history there, military history as well. Russia is the oddball here. Russia has little to no empire. It's a huge country, right? Huge nation, lots of people, large population. They do have a very large army, but in part because they have a very large population, but they're very disorganized to the point where the army doesn't even know how many people are in the army. Okay. But they have almost completely zero industry. But they want to change that. They want to start sort of, competing with these Western countries. And we'll get to the Tsar in a little bit as well. I also want to talk about Austria-Hungary because Austria-Hungary is a very old empire. It's a big empire. Remember that it's like where Marie Antoinette came from, right? Very, very old empire. And this is problematic. It's very big, and they have a lot of ethnic groups living inside of Austria-Hungary. Now, why is this a problem? Well, remember how we were talking about how Spain's influence had been in a decline? And although Spain was a huge, powerful nation, huge, huge empire, right, because of colonization and everything, eventually what happens as that empire started to decline, those people wanted independence, right? Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, Cubans in particular. And this is essentially what is happening within Austria-Hungary, right? Very old empire, huge empire, but there's many ethnic groups living inside of it that want independence. They want autonomy, right? They want to be able to govern themselves, essentially. Now, the other key to understanding Austria-Hungary in terms of everything that we're going to talk about is that they are a natural ally with Germany. Okay, Germany and Austria-Hungary are like BFFs. Okay, they go way back. Okay, at one point when Prussia, aka Germany, was unifying, they considered a Germany that included Austria. Like, that's how tight they were. Okay, I think they were going to call that Grossdeutsch. Instead, they went with Kleindeutsch. So Deutschland, right, Germany without Austria, but they're very, very close. So when things heat up, This is why Germany is essentially going to back up Austria all the way. Now let's look at some of the European leaders that we're going to be discussing, right? I just want you to be able to put a name or a face to the name, I guess is what I'm trying to say. This guy right here is King George V of Great Britain. This is Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. And Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Now, look at something here, okay? Does anything strike you as odd about this pair? Well, for these three guys that we talked about, they're cousins, like legit blood cousins. They share a grandmother, Queen Victoria. Look at this, right? If you take Tsar Nicholas, his picture here, and then you look at King George V, it's like they share an uncanny resemblance to one another. Okay, and then of course you have Kaiser Wilhelm, who has tons of issues, and I can't wait to tell you all about them. Starting with that mustache, okay? But one of the things, like I said, this is super like a sign of the times, okay? Because remember, this is going back to when, we're talking about kingdoms and they're trying to maintain the balance of power. And how did these families do that? They did it by, marrying off their children to build these alliances to stay in power. And that's essentially what happened here between Britain, Russia, and Germany, okay? But we'll get to all of that in a little bit. Now, I want to show you Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, right? One of these things is not like the other. First thing you notice about him is his age, right? Obviously, he is a lot older than the other guys here. And, normally this wouldn't be an issue, right? So what? But in the case of Austria-Hungary, the Emperor Franz Joseph is not very... Okay, he's very old-fashioned, okay? He is very old-fashioned, not really willing to modernize or give his people any kind of, certain freedoms or anything. Very, very traditional. So, for example, why is this a problem for him? Well, because when the military comes to him and says, hey, there's these new weapons and stuff like that, why don't we update our military? He's like, what's wrong with the weapons that we have? What's wrong with the rifles you have? Well, they're 10 years old. They're not anything modern. So, he just doesn't see it that way. He's like, why fix it if it ain't broke? When it comes to, and this is one of the reasons why they get into trouble, and Germany has to essentially do a lot of the fighting for them, and we'll get to Germany and the end of the war in a little bit. But, in the case of its people, very traditional style of ruling. What happens if there is dissent, amidst, in the midst of your people, or rebellion, or people are, screaming for certain rights and freedoms? Well, the emperor, what he decides to do is, to show force, is essentially to crack down, not to let go or loosen the reins at all. So again, this is going to be a problem when the Serbs kill the heir to the throne, okay? The Franz Ferdinand, which again, we'll get to that in a little bit, okay? But these are the people that we're going to be talking about. A little bit of backstory there with them. And again, it helps to know some of this, to put things in context, because when you look at Germany, it's like, oh my God, what were you thinking, Wilhelm? Why did you do these things? And so, in history, we have this little thing, it's called psychohistory. Psychohistorians, which is not like that we're psycho, but that we try to get into the mind, right? We try to figure out what were they thinking, what was their motivation. We try to find out, why did they do these things? What could have driven them to do such bad mistakes, or at least actions that resulted in just irreversible damage. in the case of Germany, I told you I've been like dying to talk about this guy because he is one of those that, like wild cards for sure. Going back to his dad, when his dad ruled Prussia, essentially he did it through his chancellor, whose name was Otto von Bismarck. Now, you might have heard of the name Bismarck before, but essentially this guy, he wasn't like a part of the ruling class or anything like that, but he was a military guy. And he was what, political scientists called a realpolitik. And a realpolitik is a politician who goes after, goals that are achievable, that are practical, doable. In fact, during the unification of Prussia or unification of Germany, he went to wars with like Denmark and, the French, but because he knew that he could win. It would be quick, it would be easy, and it would accomplish, the goal that they were after. So this was all under his father's reign. Now, his mother is British, okay? Remember, his grandmother is Queen Victoria. And his mother is British and just really doesn't like Germany very much. Hates living there. Practically like reminds him how much he hates Germany any chance that she gets. So this guy's got, mommy issues on top of the daddy issues. And so he looks at Britain, right? Looks at the empire that his cousin has. And he's jealous of it because he feels that, Germany should be the most powerful nation, should have the biggest colony, should have the biggest military. And he can't wait to prove that. So the thing is that, his dad is in charge. And while his dad is living, he's got Bismarck to essentially run the show. And Bismarck is very, very good at it. Okay. Now, when his father dies, okay, this guy's thinking, all right, it's my turn. I'm going to get to show them finally what I'm all about, what Germany is capable of doing. But Bismarck is in the way. And of course, he doesn't like Bismarck at all, right? Because he's in his way, essentially. So at the first chance that, he could fire Bismarck, he did. Bismarck would do this thing where he's a huge guy. And he would, when he couldn't get his way with the Kaiser, he would threaten to jump out the window, like, oh, I never go. I'm gonna kill myself. And it's like second story building, second story window, like nothing's gonna happen to you. You might, roll your ankle. And he would get what he wanted. But he couldn't pull that stunt with Kaiser Wilhelm II, because as soon as Bismarck threatened to quit, this guy basically told him, okay, I accept your resignation. Don't let the door hit you or the good Lord split you. So with Bismarck out of the way, this guy is essentially going to do everything in his power to showcase Germany's, true potential. The other thing I want to mention about him, some of you may already know this, but, like I said, he's got daddy issues, mommy issues, but oh man, the poor guy, he also has a huge complex, okay? Because, it's like, where can I start, right? It all started when he was born. And no joke, when he was born, he was in a breech position, which means, essentially that he wasn't like head down, engaged, like ready to be born. He was like sideways. And so if this were to happen today, to a mother that's going into labor, there's ways that they can, usually the easiest way is like a C-section, right? Because they go in there and they take the child out safely. But what they do to him is essentially the doctor takes him out, like by his arm, pulls him out. And when he does this, essentially, he like fractures his arm It's actually this one. And so this poor baby, he was injured at birth, and essentially he grows up with like a shriveled arm, which he is super embarrassed of. Goes to great lengths to hide it, to mask it, to the point where like there are no photographs of him or portraits where he's like showing his arm. He's always like somehow, hiding it or masking it or, whatever. And so as a kid, he think about this, right? If he was like anybody else, if he was a child that had been born, outside of the royal family, he would have ended up like in an institution or something like that. I mean, who knows? Horrible things could have happened to him. But he is a royal and he is the heir to the throne. And there is so much, such a huge burden weighing on him that, he really tries to overcompensate from an early age. Something as simple as like riding a horse, which of course, at this time, like everybody knows how to ride a horse. You've got to do it, especially if you're a gentleman. But it's difficult enough to do it with 2 good hands and 2 good legs. It was so hard for him. He would fall and he would get back up and try again, and he just wouldn't let anybody how can I say this, he just wouldn't take no for an answer. He was determined to prove that he was just as good as anybody else. And all of these things, right? We're talking about psychoanalyzing this guy, right? I mean, the mommy issues, right? The jealousy there with Britain, the daddy issues, right? The complexes here. He tries to overcompensate. I mean, look at all the medals that he's wearing. I mean, what? The guy, he would change uniforms 5 or 6 times a day. All right? So he's obviously trying to project this image. And so again, like I said, why am I telling you all this? Because it helps to understand the motivation behind what Kaiser Wilhelm II does. And so what does he do? Well, remember we're talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan's book? How essentially, it's the U.S. is going to, pull out all the stops, build a new navy, and the numbers, it goes from 17th in the world to number 7. Well, so does Germany. So when Germany starts building up that navy, guess what happens? It makes the British really nervous. It makes the Russians really nervous. It makes the French especially the French. Oh my God, there's tons of history there with France. It makes everybody nervous. And so he may not have been hell-bent on going to war, but, all of these nations are building up their military, they're building up their navy, and he seems like the threat here because he wants to prove that Germany's just as good, if not better, than Britain, but gets him into trouble. Other things to know as well, when it comes to Great Britain, their motivation is to protect their empire, to maintain the balance of power in their favor, of course. And like I said, they're made nervous by Germany and France. They're traditional rivals of France, but somehow they end up as allies here. And we'll discuss why in a little bit. It has everything to do with Germany. Of course it does, right? When it comes to France, France has a growing fear of Germany, in part because, the last time they went to war against Germany, and Germany just kicked the snot out of them and took, a huge chunk of land, the Alsace-Lorraine region. It was bad. It was so ugly. They won in 6 months. The Germans, they did this whole parade where they were marching through. I mean, they almost made it to the Champs-Élysées, and the French were oh no no right, you can't, we're not gonna let you do that. So it was just a humiliating defeat. They're really tired of getting invaded by the Germans, and they're on high alert. So anytime that Germany does something, they make a move, France is getting nervous. Okay, Now, another thing as well that you should know about France is that they are natural enemies of Russia and Britain. So why is this significant? Again, because they end up on the same side against Germany, right? Think of it this way. It's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? They're like frenemies or something. Okay, Russia. Russia, like I said, they're the oddball here. They are so under-industrialized. They have so many problems. They have a huge population, mostly peasant. They are, they're trying to catch up with the West, right? So they're trying to make these changes because they've been sort of oriented east in terms of their aesthetics and culture, language, architecture. And what I mean by they're orientated to the east, well, if I told you guys to draw me a picture of like a Russian building, what do they look like? And I'm not talking like Cold War Soviet era industrial like everything is square and ugly. I mean if I told you St. Petersburg, right, what's the first thing you think about? What do those buildings look like? And they look like those little towers with the little swirly thing on the top. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. So where is another building that has that sort of same architecture style? Taj Mahal, right? That's what I mean by they've been orientated east. They've been inspired by the east. They have bigger ties to the east, but they want to change that. They're trying to catch up to the West. They're trying to industrialize, but they have big problems, right? The people are growing increasingly more and more frustrated with the Tsar. They want land reform. They have a huge peasant population. There's lack of bread. And when the war gets into high gear, it's going to get really ugly around 1916, where essentially, they're going to blame the Tsar for everything. Even though the guy's genuinely trying to, motivate the army, motivate the people, inspire them. But he's essentially going to become associated with the war loss instead. Anyway, so we'll talk about Russia more later, especially with the Bolshevik Revolution and all of that. Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is taking over lands in the Balkans. Again, why are they doing this? Well, because they are experiencing a loss of power, a loss of influence, and their way of regaining that power is essentially to just do it by force, expand, take over, right? So for example, when Bosnia and Herzegovina are upset, what do they want? They want independence. Serbia wants, access to the sea. But when this is annexed, this is the last straw for the Serbs, essentially. Okay. So Italy is interesting. We're not going to talk too much about them, unfortunately. I wish this was a World War I class. Otherwise, we'd be talking tons about them. But Italy, is going to start out with the Central Powers, and then it's going to be neutral for a little bit, and then it's going to switch sides to to the Allies, essentially. But Italy wants to be a major power. They have imperial ambitions. They want lands in Austria-Hungary. And so that's going to be kind of the reason why they end up fighting with the Allies instead of with the Central Powers. But, they switch sides in the middle of the war. But, we'll talk about that later. And then, of course, this is U.S. history. So let's talk about the United States. What do they want? Remember that the U.S. foreign policy is isolationism. They do not want to get involved with European wars. All of this is a huge European entanglement that the United States wants to stay out of completely. So in 1914, when war breaks out, the United States announces its neutrality. Okay? So it's basically saying we are not going to be involved. We are going to stay out of it. You guys deal with it on your own. However, we see no reason to miss out on the opportunity here to provide all of these nations with weapons because we have the capacity to build them. We are industrialized, we got the factories, we got the workers, we want the moolah. And so this is what American neutrality looks like. We're not going to get involved in the war, but we see no problem in continuing to trade with both sides. So again, our neutrality is not to deny any side anything that they might need. And so just because you ain't picking a side doesn't mean you're neutral, especially if you are providing them with weapons, right? So anyway, this is neutrality according to Woodrow Wilson. And this is part of the reason why the United States gets into problems, because this type of neutrality, this type of isolationism is, you just can't keep it up forever, okay? Especially when Americans are dying as a result of it, okay? So, those are your countries. Here are your central powers. You got Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, also known as the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Turks, and Italy, okay? On the other side, right, the Allies, the Triple Entente, you've got Great Britain, France, Serbia, Russia, and then the United States, okay, after 1917. Okay, so like I said, there's over 60 nations that are involved in World War I. We are not going to go over all of them. There's fighting all over Africa. There's fighting, in the Pacific. Japan is involved. China is involved. It's a huge mess, okay? So, but we're going to keep it laser focused. All right, so let's talk about the spark. What is the immediate cause of the war? We talked about the long-term causes, right? We've got the perfect storm, right? We got the little powder keg ready to go. What's the spark that's going to launch this, to the next level? Well, it all started when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's this area right here, okay? Now remember, why did Austria do this? Because they're trying to maintain power over the region, and this is the way that they do it, okay, traditionally. Very old school style of, ruling and exerting your dominance. This, of course, pisses off the Serbs, because the Serbs, they want access to the sea and things like that, and they're not going to get it now that Austria has taken over Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the Serbs are going to plan an attack, okay, on Austria-Hungary. And so they're looking for the perfect opportunity to do this. And they hear that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is planning on visiting the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, okay? So this is him right here, right? That's the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, okay? So the interesting thing to this, right, is who is this guy? He is the heir to the throne of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Remember, we looked at the emperor, right? Franz Joseph, old guy, very old school, traditional, not really willing to modernize. Well, this guy, he's totally the opposite. He's got like a very modern way of thinking. He is aware of the fact that there's all of these, sub-nations that want certain freedoms and independence. They want, some autonomy. And he's trying to come up with ways of, letting them know that he cares about, their needs, and essentially that he wants to move in that direction. He's talking about things like healthcare and stuff like that. I mean, the guy is really, out there, super different than the emperor. Now, the problem is he's not the one in charge, right? So, but again, he's planning this trip to Sarajevo on none other than, Bosnian Nationalism Day. And the Black Hand find out about it. They think that, this is the perfect opportunity to essentially send a message to to the emperor that, they don't want him here. They're not welcome. They want independence. And so this sort of sense sets the wheels into motion. Okay. So let's talk about the trip. Huge backstory here also. Like, I love it. This is just like, oh my God. I know you're probably like, man, is this going to be on the test? Probably not. not this bit here, but trust me. Or I might do like a bonus questions, right? I mean, to make it worth your while. But why is this so significant? I mean, because, right, this guy gets killed and it sets those wheels in motion. So it's like, if it doesn't happen, would any of these things have happened? It's like, if I start to think about it, I'll stay up all night, just like, whoa, I'll end up like on the dark side of like YouTube. You never know. But essentially, the story behind the Archduke is this. This guy fell hopelessly in love with this woman right here, Sophie. Now, Sophie is a countess, okay? Which for all intents and purposes, in terms of lineage and like status and, like where they sit and stand, he's the heir to the throne, right? So he's like up here and she's a countess. So she's like way down here. I mean, she's like a parlor maid compared to him. And so the emperor basically like forbid him from marrying her. But he did it anyways because he loved her and he didn't care about anything. And so, the emperor is like really upset about it and, he just can't believe it. I mean, he even went to the point where he, knowing that this guy is going to marry this woman anyways, he basically said, your children will never be able to inherit the throne, if you disobey me. And this guy didn't care. Because he loved her. And this is just such a rarity, right? Because remember, this is when people are still being arranged in marriages and stuff like that. And so, again, true love story here. Now, why is this important? Let me tell you why. Because of their status, essentially when they would have like dinners and stuff like that, how you come in like by rank, right? So, he was never able to see her in public. If they were going to have a meeting like in the palace or whatever, it's like he would come in and then like everybody else, and then like her at the very end, and like they never even sat together. They were never seen in public because, just the differences in their titles and noble status. And so, but on this trip to Herzegovina, right? Bosnia-Herzegovina. Sarajevo, to Sarajevo. On this trip, it's like unofficial, we're not, in our country. So this was like totally planned on his behalf. This was going to be a wedding gift to her. They were going to ride in this parade on this car with the top down, and she was so happy. You could see it in this picture, right? She's like delighted. She's like over the moon. It's the best wedding present ever. I mean, this guy adores her. He loves her. They have children together and everything. And the other thing too is that she's married. She's pregnant. She's going to have a baby. And these two lovebirds, right? It's like, oh, okay. So why is this important? Well, because when the Black Hand finds out that he's coming and the newspapers publish the parade route, right? They know where he's going to be. These guys are going to plan an attack to kill him, okay? And so you've got Princip, Gavrila Princip, who is just one of the assassins that is like ready to, take his shot. And they actually, like, it's a whole crazy story here, right? So essentially what happens is you've got two guys that are set up, to attack first. But the first guys decided, nah, we're not going to kill anybody. We're just here, to watch. We're just going to partake, right? These were all part of the Black Hand, right? This terrorist group that is being funded by the Serbian government. Right, so the first two guys decide, now we're not going to do anything, we're just going to watch. Or Mehmet Bazi, he was actually opposed to killing, women and children and stuff like that. So he wasn't going to do it. And then the next guy, right, it's like, okay, so they're on the parade route, they're coming. And they're like, And then the next guy, okay, it's his turn. So he's got, he sees that they're coming. He's got this grenade. Okay, and he sees it, and then he just, he hits it to activate it, and then he throws it. And the guy forgot that it had a 10-second delay. Okay, I kid you not. So when he throws it, the driver sees it, right? And he's able to like step on the gas and like get ahead of it or leave it behind. And it goes off, but nothing happens to, the Archduke or the driver or his wife. The guy that threw the grenade, he didn't even stick around to see if it was effective or not. All of these guys had been provided with cyanide, to essentially like kill themselves after the attack and, not give up any secrets or anything. And so this guy, threw the grenade. Didn't wait for the 10-second delay, in order for it to be effective. I guess he forgot about it. And then decided to, take his cyanide capsule and then jump in the river to ensure that, he died. Well, two things happened. The cyanide was old and it didn't kill him. It just made him super, super sick. Like, it was like, throwing up. And then the river was actually like this deep. So he jumped in the river and they nabbed him, they got him, and threw him in jail. Meanwhile, right, it's like the driver is able to see this and he's like taking off, and he's able to avoid being hit. And Princip sees this happening, right? Princip is like next in line to like attack, right? What he's good at is guns, right? Like, he's a crack shot at it. So that was what he was going to do. That was, that was the next move. But he's so shocked by what he saw that he's like, basically like the car with the Archduke just like passes right in front of him. And he's just like, what the heck just happened? Like, I missed my shot. So, essentially what happens next is, the Archduke hears that there was people that had been injured, some civilians, and so he decides, he tells the driver, take me to the hospital, I want to see how they're doing. Just, again, he's a good guy, right? I mean, he's genuinely interested in. And so, he goes to the hospital, and Princip is just, he can't believe what happened. It's like, by the way, Princip and the other guy that threw himself in the river, they're both dying with tuberculosis, right? So this was like their opportunity to like do something for Serbian nationalism, and they missed it. They missed their opportunity. So Princip is going home. He's just like despondent, doesn't know what to do, can't believe it. He stops at a delicatessen for a sandwich. He's hungry, guys, gotta eat. And he's finishing his food, and he decides he's gonna go home, doesn't know what's gonna happen next. And then out of nowhere, here comes the Archduke's car. And, the driver got lost. He didn't know the area. He didn't know the region. And he actually turned into a street called Franz Joseph Street, which is weird because that's, the emperor's name. And so he made a wrong turn, and he's trying to, turn around, but cars were, like standard engines, not like today that it's all automatic. You have to like put it in gear. And if you know how to drive a stick, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes with those older cars, it's like, can't really quite get it in there. And Princip sees him, can't believe his eyes. It's like the heavens just opened up for him. And it's like, he sees his target, takes his shot, takes aim, and, gets 2 shots off, hits his target, and also has cyanide capsule. And there's actually a picture here where they arrested him. There he is. He sees him, shoots him, Police arrest him. Also tried to do the cyanide, but it was also old, so it just made him really sick. And Princip succeeded. And that's the thing that I'm trying to tell you. Like, all of the things that had to happen for this guy to make his shot. He didn't just shoot the Archduke, who, by the way, was wearing like a bulletproof vest and, you know, like all his Lucky Charm medals and things like that. I mean, he had been warned that he might get a hostile reception, you know, because of the Serbs were upset by what Austria-Hungary was doing. But the guy was adamant that he wanted to project a friendly image. He didn't want that many cops present. You know, he didn't want a heavy police present. He wanted, you know, the open top car. And these guys capitalized on it, right? I told you, he's wearing a bulletproof vest, all his Lucky Charms. And one of the shots got him straight in the neck and out. So there was like no protection there. Guy bleeds out. And then if you're looking and seeing like, well, who's that? That's his wife. Sophie was shot too. And he just couldn't believe it. I mean, he's like, oh my God, Sophie, you know, don't die. She'd been shot in the stomach. And I told you she was pregnant, right? She was expecting child. So Princip got his target. The mission was a success. But now come the consequences of this. Because Serbia is now in deep trouble. Once Austria-Hungary finds out that the Serbian government actually, you know, funded this terrorist attack, even with the bad cyanide, then, you know, they need to answer for what they did. So Austria-Hungary wants revenge. They learned that Serbia supplied the weapons to the Black Hand, and they want war with Serbia. Now, this is where it gets interesting, right? Because those alliances are gonna trigger. It just so happens that Russia is like a big brother to Serbia. And this is because, you know, they are both, what do you call it? They share a lot of commonalities, like language and, oh my gosh, like traditions and things like that. So when Austria-Hungary wants to attack and go to war with Serbia, the Russians are basically going like, well, wait a minute, that's like my little brother. I'm not going to let you attack them. I'm going to defend them. And so this should be a deterrent, right? Because as soon as Austria-Hungary sees that Russia is jumping in, what should happen? Well, they should go, oh, never mind. I don't want, you know, let's squash that beef. But that's not what happens. Because when Russia jumps in, Austria's BFF jumps in. And who's that? Germany. And Germany essentially tells Austria, yeah, I got your back, whatever you need. Essentially, you know, like historians call this the blank check. That Germany gave Austria a blank check saying, yeah, we'll back you up 100%. And in a way, emboldened Austria-Hungary to continue on this war path. So, July 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And the alliances are triggered, right? You got Russia then declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declares war on Russia. France will declare war on Germany. Britain declares war on Germany. And Italy stays out for now. So, of course, you're probably wondering, well, wait a minute. Whoa. What does France and Britain have anything to do with it? Well, it's a little complicated. But essentially, you know, when war is declared, all of these nations are celebrating. They're all super excited to go to war because remember, nationalism, right? Their last memory of a war was war that was quick, easy, glorious. They were expecting this to happen for themselves as well, right? They're like ready to go to war. They're ready to prove that their nation is the best once and for all. And so the question is, why does France and Britain get involved in this? What's their deal? What's this all about? Well, remember, there's a lot of history here between Germany and France and Russia and France and the UK, right? But essentially it comes down to this. Germany knows that it's going to go to war with Russia, okay? But they also know that eventually they're going to go to war with France, okay? So their plan here is to avoid a two-front war, okay? Because if you look at the location, Germany is sandwiched between France and Russia, okay? The last thing that you want to do is fight a two-front war, okay? Why? Because it splits up your resources, splits up your manpower, makes it twice as likely that you're going to fail. And, like I said, it increases your chances of failure and also increases the amount of time that it's going to take you to win. So you never want to do that. You always want to fight, one side first and then do the other side. And so how does France get mixed up in all of this? Well, like I said, Germany knows that they are going to go to war with Russia, okay? Russia's a huge country, lots of people, huge army, but it's going to take them a very long time to actually mobilize those big armies that are super unorganized and make it to the front. So in order to avoid fighting two countries at the same time on opposite fronts, Germany decides that their plan to avoid a two-front war is essentially to attack France and defeat them quickly. So much so that, Britain is going to be like shocked that they're not going to want anything to do with this. And then, defeat France, fight, capture Paris, defeat the French. And then once that's done and the UK is out of it, essentially march back to the Eastern Front, by which time the Russian army will make it to the border, fight the Russians, win, and be home by Christmas. I mean, that's quite the audacious plan, right? But that's exactly what it is. That is literally Germany's plan for victory. It's called the Schlieffen Plan, okay? Now, it's developed by Germany's General Schlieffen. The plan here, remember, is to hold off Russia in the east because they're such a big country. It's going to take them, weeks and weeks to mobilize, to actually months, right, to make it to the front. In which time, Germany is going to march through Belgium, which is neutral, right? Why not just go across the forest, like right into France? Well, because of the Ardennes forest. Can't make it through there. Okay, so the plan is march through neutral Belgium, which is going to make it easier on them, in theory, and then take Paris, defeat the French, make it back to Germany, fight the Russians, and be home by Christmas, right? Now, the key here also is in defeating France so decisively, so quickly, that Great Britain is not going to want anything to do with it, okay? This is the plan, okay, you guys? And as you know, or if you didn't know, let me tell you, almost always in war, nothing goes according to plan. And in the case of the Schlieffen Plan, literally every single thing that could go wrong goes wrong. And in the plan, where literally everything has to go right in order for it to work, everything goes wrong, okay? Because as soon as war is declared, the clock is ticking. Nations are mobilizing, okay? And the really odd thing about all this is that Russia's mobilizing already, and then you have the Kaiser, like, in his yacht in the Mediterranean. Like, literally, it's like the generals are scrambling, like, where is he? He needs to give the order. And it's like you're calling somebody and no one's picking up, right? So this delays also the German movements as well. Okay, so what was the next step? Okay, the next step is to march through Belgium, right, which is neutral. Again, you don't want to go through here because of the Ardennes force. It would make it very, very difficult to get through there. And so the plan is to march through Belgium, right? They think that Belgium is just going to let them. And when they do that, they're going to take Paris, capture Paris, defeat the French so quickly that it's going to cause the British to go, yeah, never mind, we don't want anything to do with that. And then go ahead and march to the Eastern Front, fight the Russians, and call it a day. But that's not what happens, right? Because the next step is march through Belgium, and that doesn't happen, right? Belgium is the key. Belgium actually fights back. Right? Germany asks permission to march, and Belgium says, no, we are neutral. You stay out of our country. To which the Germans respond by basically attacking their fortifications and going to war with a country that had nothing to do with any of this. So, why is Belgium the key? When Germany attacks Belgium, England jumps in. Right? The British jump in. They are now going to get involved in the war in order to defend Belgium. Okay? And so remember, part of the plan here was to shock the British into not wanting anything to do with this. And that's exactly the opposite of what happens, right? Because now, all kinds of propaganda about what the Germans did, the Huns, right, as they call them, what they did to the people in Belgium is going to create a lot of anti-German sentiment. People are going to enlist, and essentially the plan is failing, you guys, because the Germans are going to be slowed down by Belgium by a matter of days, which is going to give the French a chance to make it to stop the Germans from reaching Paris. The British Expeditionary Force is then going to go ahead and also land in France, essentially halting the German advance from reaching Paris. So remember, everything is supposed to go according to plan, and nothing does. Okay? So what was it that the Germans were trying to avoid here? A two-front war. And what was it that they got? A two-front war. And not only that, now they got Belgium and the British to fight as well. Okay, so the first series of battles are going to take place essentially near the Marne River. Okay, remember the plan is to make it to Paris, but they don't make it. They are stopped short of that by the River Marne, and that's where you got the first series of battles at the First Battle of the Marne. Okay, you got British and the French counterattack there, September 5th through the 12th, 1914. Heavy casualties. Okay, like I said in the beginning, in all of this, it's like you've got, cavalry, French cavalry, these guys in horses, and then what happens? They are met with these shells, with these gigantic, 2,000-pound shells, and it just completely obliterates them. The whole idea of trench warfare, it's not like that was the plan. That was not the strategy. It's not like they were there like, oh yeah, we're gonna get there, we're gonna build these trenches in the system, and then we're gonna try to outflank each other in this 350-mile race to the sea. That is not what happened. It was literally these soldiers trying to take cover once they saw the kind of weapons that they were facing, the kind of casualties that were mounting. And so both sides are going to dig trenches literally to take cover. And, when you look at the nature of it too, it's like, look at these guys, right? I mean, look at how they start out. They've got those helmets with those spikes sticking out of it. I mean, in a trench environment, that's the last thing that you want to be wearing. Okay? Why? Well, you're sitting in a hole, right? You're trying to take cover, and then you got this thing sticking out of your helmet. because you're walking up and down. I mean, it's like those ducks, right, at the carnival, like pew pew. It's like, no. I mean, oh gosh, there is so much. I love this thing about World War I because there's this like learning curve, right? They go in here expecting it's going to be quick, it's going to be fast, it's going to be glorious, and it is everything but that. The French have these like bright, bold uniforms, with like red shirts with like the things that hold their oh my gosh, in Spanish they're called like cananas. And so what does that look like from far away? It's like red shirts and a white X across it's like a target. Yeah, that's the reality that they're facing. Very, very quickly they realize that this is not going to be a short war, although they really want to believe it. The type of technology that they have to kill farly just outweighs their capacity to heal by leaps and bounds. The nature of the fighting too, they're in these trenches. The conditions are just completely inhumane. I mean, we're talking 350 miles of these lines, so that these trenches that essentially you have the enemy on the opposite side. And throughout the entire 4 years of the war, those lines hardly ever move. And so at the end of this, we're not going to get to talk about specific battles, although I will mention a few of them. Like Verdun, it's like 1 million casualties. A million. For what? For a couple of yards, only to lose them? Insane. It's insanity. Life in the trenches is another thing I want to talk about very quickly. Like I said, these trenches are going to be pretty stationary. They're not going to move very much. You, of course, have no man's land, right? Which is literally like, you don't want to be there. Why? Well, let me tell you why. Because there's these long-range artillery guns. Everything is being shot at right here. No man's land is like the area between the enemy sides, okay? You don't want to be there. Everything is being shot at you. There's no way that you could possibly shoot back because look, they're 10 kilometers behind. And then if you're lucky to make it to the other side, because you got to dodge all of these shells that are like blasting all around you. And then if you make it to the other side, you've got barbed wire, devil's rope, like they call it, to deal with, which again, it tangles you up and it makes it easy for, these guys over here in these concrete pillboxes to basically take you out, right? Nothing makes sense in this kind of environment. You see the airplanes up here, right? In the beginning of the war, and actually, if you think about it, I mean, the Wright brothers had launched the first airplane, right? I mean, not that long before World War I broke out. And or the Great War, right? And they were just horrified. I mean, they could not have imagined that, they'd be using planes for this. But in the beginning of the war, they're not really using planes the way that we think of them nowadays, like dogfights and stuff like that. In the beginning, it's mostly for like reconnaissance, like gathering information, like literally like how many clicks back are these artillery guns located, or how many pillboxes do you see, or where are the COs, and things like that. Eventually, they will figure it out how to drop supplies, how to drop bombs, how to engage, into these fights in the air with other planes. And like I said, that was a learning curve as well. because, it was kind of hard to figure out exactly how to shoot those guns while in air, how to get the timing, just right. Because when they try to do it at first, they would be like shooting off their propeller and stuff like that. So, it's like those little timed guns, basically, when they shoot right, in the perfect time when the propeller, is not gonna get shot and help you crash. But you don't want to be there. There's mud, and once they start using the poison gases and stuff like that, those shell holes are gonna be deadly. Like you could jump in there thinking, okay, I'm safe here, and then get into that hole, and then it's like full of these like toxic gases and stuff like that. So that could be also deadly as well. And if you're thinking like, wait a minute, why would I jump in a shell hole? Well, again, this goes to the point that I was trying to make, that in this environment, like, nothing makes any sense. Nothing makes any sense. If a bomb were to drop right here, and a crater was created from, the explosion, and all of this earth just went flying, the last thing that you would want to do is jump in that hole. What is your fight or flight response telling you to do? To get out of here, to run the opposite direction, zigzag, serpentine, do something. But one of the things that they're going to figure out is that, okay, if these artillery guns are, 10 kilometers back, they're constantly trying to move them around and stuff like that. Chances are, if a shell just went off right here, chances are another one isn't going to land in exactly the same place. So the safest place to be is where it just went off. And so it doesn't make any sense, right? It defies logic, but not in this world, where rules of society clearly do not apply. Funny story, not funny like haha, but again, like I said, in this war there's a steep learning curve. They're figuring all this stuff out as the war continues. Man, they're figuring this stuff out. So once they know that soldiers are jumping into shell holes and stuff like that, one of like the little tricks that they do is they see them, they shoot the shell, blows up, soldiers jump in there, and then what do? You shoot inside of the shells, right? Waiting for them to jump for cover. So figuring this stuff out. Really, really interesting stuff. But no cover here. You don't want to be there. Another thing too is like, okay, you think you're safe in your trenches? They don't want you in there. They don't want you in there. They want you to get out of those trenches, get into enemy lines, or being ordered, to get out of there. But yeah, it's tough. Life in these trenches is just pretty miserable. You can imagine. The constant bombardment. Sometimes it's 20 hours nonstop, 22, 23. And it just doesn't let up. It's like the creeping barrage, right? The shells, they get closer and closer and closer. And it's an assault on the senses. It's an assault on your, on your mind. And after hours and hours of this bombardment, it stops. And then what comes next. Because once the bombardment stops, the men are ordered to go. And so, surviving that is tricky. Other things that kind of go without saying that maybe you have or haven't thought about before is the weather. Especially during the raining season. Look at these guys. They got water almost to their knees. This is going to create problems, very unsanitary conditions that result in, gangrene, trench foot, trench mouth. I'm not going to show you what that looks like. You can Google that yourself. Or it's like trench foot in your mouth. Oh gosh. And you think, oh, okay, well, so what? It's not like you got wounded or anything like that. But a soldier that has trench foot can't fight. And so, keeping these guys healthy is an uphill battle. But they also have to fight, not just the enemy, they also have to deal with rats. Rats are a huge problem, in part because they're huge. You got dead bodies, you got open latrines. Latrines, of course, are literally like a hole in the ground where they go to the bathroom. It's like an outhouse without, the house. Diseases, lice, piojos, they're on everything. They're on everybody. They do these like little, oh my gosh, it's like a little social gathering thing that they do where they literally hang around together and they like pop each other's lice, which is essentially like where chatting comes from. If you've ever popped a lice, you'll never forget it. It's like a little, let me get that close to the mic. You pop it, you pop the belly, with your fingernails. That's how you kill it. And it makes this little noise, which is the chat. And so it's not, they're hanging around and it's like a social gathering thing that they do. So, that's where chatting comes from. It's not like, hey, let's go have a conversation. It's literally like we're hanging out, we're popping each other's lice, to kind of defeat our boredom. Dead bodies, the smells, the sights, the horrors. Yeah. But anyways, I'd invite you to do more research on the trenches. And if you are so inclined, look at World War I soldiers who actually were artists. Read their poems. Look at their paintings. Otto Dix is one of my favorite, Dix. There's so many good books that come out of this time period too. Lots of stuff that really makes you go, really appreciate what these guys were feeling and going through. Really like apocalyptic, right? But we'll talk more about that in the 20s. So yeah, leading up to World War II. New weapons of war. You got poison gases, machine guns, tanks. Tanks are another one that, when they first started using them, they weren't as effective. They were very slow. They actually broke down a lot. But they're like on the fear scale, 10 out of 10. And again, it's not until like year 3, like 1917, when they are figuring out how to use all of these weapons. I'm so sorry. All of these weapons in conjunction with one another. So you've got, the machine guns, you've got the shells, you've got the tanks, you've got flamethrowers, you've got poison gas, you use them all in conjunction, and then it's like, whoa, they figured it out. But in the beginning, not very effective. And then, of course, for the Germans, their ultimate weapon here is the U-boat, right? The Unterseeboot, which is a submarine. Really going to dominate the seas, big time. These long-range artillery, I don't think this is going to play for me because it's not showing me the little thing. But like I said, they have these huge weapons. Their shells are, 2,000 pounds, which is a ton. The shell, I'm talking about the projectile that comes out of this thing. They've got guns like the Paris gun that can shoot from 60 miles away. Guys, that's like from here to Kotula, okay? Like, okay, think about that. From here to Kotula. The machine guns, the mortar shells, just incredible stuff. Incredible stuff. How could they even have imagined that this was going to be anything less than, 4 years of brutal war of attrition. So anyways, like I said, German U-boats, that's their secret weapon. It's going to help them really dominate for a while. warfare is going to become a thing as well. But look, they're like biplanes, right? It's like really early stuff. Poison gases is another one. Germans are going to use this first, and then they're going to start to build these kind of like rudimentary gas masks to protect each other from it. Once everybody's got those masks on, then the gas is going to be pretty much ineffective. But if it got you, I mean, the effects were just deadly. Tanks, man, I love this picture because it's like, what the heck is that? I mean, they're really, like I said, they're really playing around with the designs. I've seen pictures of some like Russian tanks that have like this huge steering wheel, not a steering wheel, like a Ferris wheel almost. They're supposed to like, be able to go over any terrain. And then of course there's like a little molehill and then they get stuck. But like I said, by the time they get to, year 3, they don't get much faster, they get about 2 miles per hour faster, but man, they become really effective because then you got the fear factor. Plus, like I said, the airplanes, and you've got, these troops, ground troops, and what did I tell you they're called? Oh my gosh, I'm like totally drawing a blank with the flamethrowers and things like that. Highly effective. And anyways, by the time we get to World War II, it's a no contest, right? It's like a totally different, blitzkrieg, right? That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, guys, this is what we've been waiting for. This is what we're going to finish off with today. Let's talk about the United States in World War I, right? There's so much going on with World War I. Like I said, I wish I could do a class just on it. I would love it, a whole year of World War I. I think you would enjoy it too. But we got to talk about the U.S. And in this short little video, it's going to talk about specific things that I want you to take note of. So as you're watching this video, feel free to take a couple of notes, and then we'll go ahead and wind it down for today, and then tomorrow you can expect to see part 2 of this lecture. Okay?
It was labeled the war to end all wars, and for the first 3 years America sat on the sideline. It was World War I. A decisive reason for America's Declaration of Independence was weariness from involvement in Europe's endless wars. Washington's farewell address warned against such military involvement, and for over 100 years this policy served the nation well. In June 1914, after a Bosnian terrorist assassinated the Archduke of Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, setting in motion a domino effect of alliances that ended in the Central Powers of Europe, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, at war with the Allies, France, Britain, and Russia. This would be the last war started by the feudal agreements of the kings and queens of Europe. Within days, Europe was ablaze. In the beginning, President Wilson declared America's complete neutrality. However, internal sentiment polarized around the war's participants. The nation's large German population supported Germany. The predominant English-speaking population backed the Allies, except for the anti-British Irish Americans. In the war's first month, the German army rolled through Belgium and northern France until stopped at the Marne in September. For the next 4 years, the war bogged down in hideous trench warfare. As Europeans slaughtered each other, American business quickly learned to profit from the war, selling goods and supplies to both sides. This meant shipping across the Atlantic Ocean, an activity that would eventually draw the country into the war. Britain blockaded ports of entry for supplies bound for Germany. The Germans employed their novel weapon, the submarine, to sink American merchant ships aiding the Allies. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the Titanic's sister ship, the Lusitania, carrying many American women and children. The ship sunk quickly, killing hundreds. The sinking shocked the nation. The U.S. demanded immediate reparations from Germany. When Germany failed to do so, it pushed Wilson towards the side of the Allies. Over the next 2 years, German U-boats continued to sink more American ships, and the United States' position of neutrality deteriorated. In 1916, Wilson campaigned for the presidency on the theme, "He kept us out of war." But privately, he told his advisor, Colonel House, that if some formula for peace between Germany and the Allies did not appear quickly, we must inevitably drift into war with Germany on the submarine issue. In 1917, World War I entered its third year. The combatants were still bogged down in senseless trench warfare, but both sides still foolishly clung to the prospect of victory. For America, the trigger for war came when Germany decided on January 31, 1917, that it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. 3 days later, Wilson broke off diplomatic relations with Germany. A month later, a decoded message from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico was given to Wilson. It urged Mexico to declare war on the United States if America entered the war on the side of the Allies. In return, Germany would guarantee the return of the lands Mexico lost in the 1848 Mexican-American War. When the notorious Zimmermann telegraph was released, public outcry demanded war against the Germans. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. In his speech, he said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." For the first time, advocacy of democracy around the world became a reason for the United States to flex its military might. Henceforth, spreading and protecting democracy would become the major justification for American military involvement into the 21st century.
Okay, you guys, so to finish off for today, remember, what is the U.S. position when it comes to the Great War, World War I? The U.S. is going to remain neutral as long as it can. But it is going to agree to sell war materials to both sides, whoever needs it. This is where it gets tricky, okay? Because U.S. ships are being stopped by the British Navy. They're being stopped by, German U-boats are being sunk. And where the United States really thinks that, they should be left alone is because they believe that they have, freedom of trade, freedom of the seas. Even though they're not involved in the war, the Germans see this as, you're helping our enemy, and the British see this as problematic too. So in the next lecture that we're going to be doing, we're going to talk about, the causes that bring the U.S. into war finally in 1917. And then we're going to talk about, the conclusion of the war. We'll talk about several battles. We'll talk about the U.S. involvement. We'll talk about how it affected people at home. And then, of course, the Treaty of Versailles and the conclusion. Okay, so come back and see me for the next lecture. I hope that you enjoyed this one. And I can't wait to see you next time. Okay, see you later. Bye.